listeners, and welcome to Plugged In, the Energy News podcast from Montel, where we bring you the latest news, issues, and changes happening in the energy sector. In this week's episode, we are looking at the guarantees of origin market. Over the last month, some market participants have said that the Norwegian government has laid open the possibility for the double counting of geo certificates, a move that has raised criticism after Iceland was accused of a similar action last year. Has the reliability of the guarantee of origin market been called into question amid a continued fall in prices in 2025? It also begs the question, where is the confidence in the market and when will prices start rising again? I'm going to be speaking to Daniel Arnesson, Manager of Renewable Power Analysis at Veyt, to discuss some of these questions. But first, I'm joined here in Oslo by our Norway editor, Gert over Mollestad. Welcome to the podcast, Gert.
Thank you.
So I gather in recent weeks, Norway seems to be opening up for the double counting or double claiming of geos. What's happening? What's occurred?
Well, in March, there was a press release from the Norwegian government stating that they had reached some sort of deal or agreement with the industry players and also union players here in Norway. And then it came, well, it wasn't completely unexpected, but they stated that there were an agreement between the parties that Norway will prepare some kind of guide for Norwegian companies on methods for calculating greenhouse gas emissions related to electricity consumption, and also that there's a web page that will show the physical power mix in Norway. And they also stated that the government would work for they would work internationally for a location-based approach, which is the opposite of the market-based geo thing. But still, when we asked the energy ministry what this all meant, then they also said that Norway will still be a part of the geo market. So it seems that they kind of intend to ride the two horses at the same time here.
They want their cake and they want to eat it. Yeah,
precisely.
Yeah, exactly. And so basically, when you're wanting location based pricing and also market-based guarantees of origin. So it seems, it does open for double counting, as I said in the opening question, Gert, do you think?
That was at least what, when we talked to market players that follow the geo market very closely, they were very adamant that it's open for double counting, and they were very disappointed and surprised also by the move from the government, riding the two horses at the same time.
But it's clear, Norway is the biggest exporter of guarantees of origin in Europe on a country basis. But still, there's a lot of opposition to the whole market in Norway. Why is that?
Absolutely. And that comes from the industry. They have been very opposed to the system, many of the huge power consumers, because they don't want to, as they say, they have a green electricity here in Norway, and the physical mix is green, more or less, 100%. And they don't want to pay extra for that, as they say. So they want kind of the benefit from the green power here in Norway, while at the same time the government allows the power companies to export geos and provide revenue for them. So Norway as a whole kind of likes to reap all the benefits here, and that's where the double counting come in.
Accusations about double counting coming in, but I think it's very clear Norway wants the best of both worlds, but we'll see how long that can continue.
Yeah, that's an exciting thing to watch closely, yes. Yeah.
Perfect, Gert. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to welcome Daniel Arnesson, Manager of Renewable Power Analysis at Veyt. A warm welcome back to the podcast, Daniel.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we talk about the current dynamics in the guarantees of origin market, I'd like to discuss a little bit about the current geopolitical reality and its implications for geos and also for renewables, expansion, growth of renewables, both on this continent and elsewhere. What's market sentiment like at the moment? Would you say?
Well, obviously, it's quite bearish. Any uncertainty to any market is not that great. And the implications of tariff, well, first of all, we have seen it back and forth in terms of the reality of the tariffs. So that's the uncertainties there. And then there's huge uncertainties with respect to its true implications because supply chains are complex and everything. So it's difficult to see how this is going to play out when they are and if they are implemented. Some are supposed to be implemented on China now at least. So what kind of ripple effect will that have to the global economy? That's going to be...
That's an important question, I think.
Yeah, it's important and very complex.
And as you mentioned, it's almost changing, certainly day by day or hour by hour. It seems to have calmed a little bit down now from the roller coaster we saw last week, Daniel. But, obviously oil and gas prices have been directly affected and have tumbled quite a bit. Certainly did in the previous week or early April when the tariffs were announced, early mid-April. But it's a little bit harder to discern that for markets such as the guarantees of origin market, isn't it? There's no direct kind of link as such.
No, it's not direct, but it's not immune. So the market sentiments, there is the spillover there you see, but the price movement you may see, it's not directly connected to any rational kind of fundamental analysis of the market, but rather market sentiment spillover. And then it's difficult to say what's affecting the market in terms of the tariffs, or if there are other things that we're probably going to discuss in the podcast that might affect it, like changing policies in Europe and so forth.
And we'll go into more detail on those for sure, Daniel. But does it affect investor appetite? Sort of, you mentioned uncertainty, unpredictability, volatility. It does mean that some investors may hold back, does it?
Certainly, because the risk is suddenly a lot higher in the market, and as I said, the implications on the economy is harder to assess. There is these questions like, how will industry fare? That is, I would say, also for the guarantees of origin market, it's a very essential question it's a very important question because a lot of the incentives that have come as of late in the EU have shifted kind of from just focusing on supply to end consumers, and that's corporate demand, but also a lot industrial and strong incentive for industries to consume renewable or carbon-free electricity. And obviously, if it hits those, then it's going to have an impact on prices of geos, but also prices of demand, also demand of electricity. And this is one thing we have seen we have seen an increasing number of negative power prices, and that is a result of a rapid capacity build out in supply and a demand that doesn't match that. And if we have a demand side that then is suffering, then that balance can be shifted even more, and that is obviously a risk.
Absolutely, and I think if you look at the dynamics there, you sense that if industry is struggling in a global trade war, the resources and the revenue and the appetite to engage in procuring more renewables or buying guarantees of origin is lessened.
Of course. And there I see, even before this announcement with the tariffs and so forth, the European Union went out with a clean industrial deal. And there is a lot of emphasis on decarbonized procurement and other incentives for industry. And I really think that, and we have shifted focus a lot more onto, how will public funds be spent to support the green transition, support industry. There's a lot of talk of militarization or the spending on defense. Like, how will that look? Will it be spending on a green military in a way? If you look at, procurements there. But there's a clear intention, at least we see in the EU, to support the industry, and we see Germany, for instance, with their kind of whatever it takes package to support the green transition, and that will be very important going forward.
Absolutely. Let's take a sort of deep dive into what's happening in the guarantees of origin market and the dynamics there. Prices fell sharply last year and have continued down this year in 2025. Do you think they will start rising again, and when do you think they will do so?
Yeah, so we presented during the Rex market meeting last week. In Amsterdam, we did present our preliminary results. But that is in the backdrop of a lot of policy changes that have come as of recent. But there we see that the market will tightening going forward. And that's as a result of this increasing role that we see geos playing, not only for suppliers and for their disclosure of the supplied electricity, but also for end consumers in their reporting obligations. And we got national cancellation data from different registries, and they are showing that for 2024, when the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive first rolled out for the first set of companies, there we have seen an increase in demand. And that can obviously also come from lower prices, but we've seen similar things happening historically when they have been shifted in or policies has strengthened the role of geos. And if this trend continues, we do see a tightening on the market, and we also see that from market participants. Like, the market is still traded in contango. What is currently affecting the market, I would say, is that in terms of supply from 2024, there's a lot more certainty as of 2024 was a good year. So we know that we come with that in the luggage going into 2025, but we don't know what the demand was. But our preliminary numbers shows that they are positive. So we do think that when there's more certainty with respect to the cancellations, and possibly supported also by 2025 so far, has not been that a lot of renewable power production, prices will start increasing again.
That's very, very interesting. But before we continue, Daniel, I'd just like for those listeners who are hearing the word cancellation, what does that mean in terms of just a brief aside, a brief explanation of that term and its implications for the guarantees of origin markets? Daniel, could you explain to those listeners?
Yeah, of course. So essentially, cancellation is the materialization of the demand. That's how you make use of the guarantees of origin. The only other way that guarantees of origin can fall out of the system is by them expiring. So that's essentially a measurement of the demand.
Exactly. So when a company buys a geo, for example, it will then cancel it. Yeah, exactly. And that's out of the system, and they move on. And exactly. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, perfect. So, but do you still think then that this supply demand balance will tighten towards 2030? And I mean, we are seeing prices historically not at their low point, but certainly given recent moves around €10 for a guarantee order, and certainly much, much lower than that. Do you expect to see them moving higher towards 2030?
Yes, we do think so. And that is essentially because we see the market tightening going forward. We think so in our models. There's also the demand side is one thing, but also on the supply side, we see the market is struggling from these two consecutive years of high supply. But we've also seen weather is not that, it's been exceptional in 2024. Generally that don't last, right? And we see that this year. It's a drier year. It's milder as well, so it's not as much production from hydro here in the Nordics. But we also see that the negative power prices that we've seen, the high interest rate, that has dampened the investments a bit. We saw a couple of failed auctions for new installations. And more importantly as well, maybe, is also the difficult conditions on the power market can also affect whether or not you continue production or you decommission power generation in Germany for that power generation that falls under the support system. Because currently, if you get support in Germany, you can't get guarantees of origin.
If you get subsidies there from
exactly. Exactly.
So you see, if I understand you correctly here, Danny, you're saying what the supply side is going to not keep pace at a similar rate as it has done over the last couple of years. It's going to slow down a touch.
At least now, and we kind of like this is often how it is in markets, right? It's you see this cyclic kind of how they are responding to the prices. 2022 was very high prices, and we have the emergency measures with respect to the war in Ukraine that boosted the investments and installations. Now we have a different kind of macroeconomic condition with high interest rate. They are slowly settling down, but they're not where they were before.
Absolutely, but they're not coming down as quickly as maybe some had wanted or hoped even, or expected. You mentioned the EU's Corporate Sustainability Directive, so the CSRD, another lovely acronym here in the Guarantees of Origin market. But how crucial is that for the demand for Guarantees of Origin going forward?
Yeah, so the CSRD is one puzzle of many. So it's not the driver here. Like what it does is that it does provide an incentive for end consumers to use Guarantees of Origin, because it has this rule like if you want to disclose the energy mix, then it's Guarantees of Origin. If it's carbon accounting, then you need to use both location-based accounting and market-based. And market-based is essentially engaging in Guarantees of Origin. But it's still voluntary, right? It's still voluntary. So the pure incentive there is that companies want to appear good in their sustainability reporting. What I think will be an even more important instrument, and I mentioned it, or come several instruments under it, I guess, is the Clean Industrial Deal. How will that materialize? What kind of incentive will we see? Like the strongest incentive I see now in the market is the CO2 compensation schemes, like the state aid for energy-intensive industries, where they can engage in energy transition measures and get funds essentially for the cost that they incur from higher power prices due to the carbon scheme. And I think we will need to see more of those things.
Dealing with the carbon emission side, or dealing with the renewable energy side, or the Guarantees of Origin side, do you mean?
Rather dealing with, I would say, the ability of European industry to compete globally. So supporting like the industry in a global market where there is less carbon pricing, because in Europe we have historically been progressive there.
And there are measures in place, which the notorious one is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. That's a clear one. But I think, it's an increasingly complex picture, and also where the geopolitics are coming into role. The market is certainly changing in terms of the trade dynamics and flows, but it's absolutely clear that the European Union wants to support its industry and wants to ensure that it remains competitive. Whether I think some of the factors here are out of its own hands, I think, in terms of global dynamics happening at the moment. But I think there's a couple of areas I'd like to touch on with you, Daniel. And one is this market-based versus location-based. That these are the kind of issues here, as well as some of the hourly versus yearly versus monthly matching or Guarantees of Origin. Those to me they seem to be very much discussed. They've been discussed for several years now. How do you currently perceive the confidence in the market, Daniel? There's been criticism against double claiming. So, for example, the Iceland case, now also Norway saying it will work for a location-based approach that allows companies claim renewables based on the local production mix rather than on the market base, which you highlighted earlier, the use of or buying Guarantees of Origin. What's happening at the moment? There seems to be sort of a little bit of a split here.
Yeah, so this discussion has been ongoing for a very long time.
You sound as though you're a bit weary by it, Daniel. Yeah.
No, but and obviously there was a spotlight put on it when the AIB imposed the export ban on Iceland.
That's the Association of Issuing Bodies, which is the kind of organisation that provides the rules for the share market. Yeah.
Exactly. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, so that kind of brought that to light again, and there is this issue with generally in the EU, they adopt the RED 2 and so forth. Norway is after that. They haven't implemented the Renewable Energy Directive 2, still in discussions, and that strengthened the role of geos.
So the directive does?
Yeah, the directive does. Parallel to that, there's always been this debate in Norway between, like the power generation industry and, like the manufacturing industry in Norway. And the manufacturing industry has been very much pushing for a location-based method because simply then they don't have to do much because they have very clean electricity here. But if you have the market-based, suddenly the electricity in Norway is becoming quite dirty.
And that's very hard for some people to understand.
Yeah, it can be. But that's essentially a way of introducing a market incentive to drive renewables, right? Without that, in a location, like you wouldn't have anything that drives the renewable energy capacity build out except for support. This is the mechanism. The problem we see in the EU and with respect to the guarantees of origin system is that it has very much been developed through an experimental approach. So the directive sets goals and countries transpose the kind of rules in the directive and in a way that can't contradict the goal of the directive, but they have different natures. And on top of that, connecting to what you were calling in terms of temporal matching. So some countries have temporal matching annual, others have not. Many have not. So you can use one old certificates for later years as long as they are still haven't expired. So that's one thing. And then another thing is that on top of that, you have policies within the EU in the proximity of the regulation of the guarantees of origin system that is driving demand in different ways. And for instance, one regulation is the CO2 compensation scheme that many countries have implemented. Norway is one of them. And in Norway, the politician has implemented a system which is driven by the location-based method. And that's an interpretation of the Commission's guidelines on this area, where they say you need to consume carbon-free electricity.
So there's a contradiction here, you're saying?
So other countries, most other countries, except for France, which have a kind of a hybrid approach, but most other countries have implemented a market-based approach there. So like in order to claim that you're consuming carbon-free or renewable electricity, you need to combine that with the guarantees of origin. In Norway, you don't, which essentially triggers this double counting across policy.
So it's a Norway problem more than anything.
Yeah. But that's one policy of many. And then you have the CSRD, you have discussions on the Green Claims Directive. And one of the issues I see in Europe is that there's not as sufficient dialogue across or harmonization across these policies.
Ideally, you'd want a single overarching directive or a policy that covered all these bases rather than having it so fragmented. And obviously, it increases the complexity and the cost for companies to comply with all these regimes. But where do you see this landing in Norway, market versus location-based? I mean,
I can't see this. So you can't be part of the internal market and then say only in certain aspects. I think the transposition of renewable, with transposition essentially means that you implement a national law, the Renewable Energy Directive 2. I see that as crucial, and when that has done, like I can't see a way out of for Norway here. Like in a way, it's more politics, the discussions I think of pushing for location-based or so forth. Whatever's going to happen with market-based and location-based, it needs to happen on an EU EEA level, not through Norway itself.
Going for the exception here, and I think that obviously that debate is about to start. Some directives are going to be pushed through the Norwegian Parliament. Others are said to be waiting in the wings for a few years. So we'll see how that develops, Daniel. But I think I can imagine the debates will rage in the months and to come. But you mentioned this matching issue. That's the other thing that I wanted to bring up with you. Now, this is certainly comes to the fore with many for 24/7 kind of matching programs out there. But how would a possible move towards monthly of an hourly matching affect the market dynamics and price levels? Is it realistic short term? I mean, you're saying going from a yearly matching system to hourly or monthly. That's quite a step forward, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Well, essentially, the tighter the matching gap is, the more the market would be affected by short-term drivers, weather, essentially. And you mentioned hourly and monthly, but to be honest, we don't have annual matching in Europe. Some countries do. Spain is a good example of that, but many countries don't have, and that gives rise to a bit of frustration in the market, I think, because I think people think that they are on unequal terms in a way. But the problem there that people are pointing to is that you can use you can use 2024 for disclosure of 2025 consumption of electricity. And that is people highlighting as a problem. I'm not to say, one of the benefit with this is that it support liquidity in the market. The downside is, of course, what we have seen now, like a large oversupply have been built up in the market as companies or suppliers and so forth are rolling over old and swapping forward, so a market balance is slowly building up, and we have estimated that based on calculations that it's 178 terawatt hours that rolled over from to 2024, and 2024 is yet to be established, right? And obviously that is kind of like a wet blanket on prices, and that is frustrating for many. In the UK market, for instance, they don't have, to my knowledge at least, any matching requirement there either. But there they have a market that is very short. So all certificates have been consumed. So essentially it's operating as a annual matched market. And that's where I generally say, the biggest problem with the geo market, if we would talk about it, is driving demand a bit. Because then you have a situation where it gives the right price signal. But if you don't work on the demand, and that is quite problematic in a market, I would say, where you talk a lot about CFDs and different ways of supporting new power generation to get in without talking about the demand side. And that is something that I think was negative with the stop the clock on the CSRD. The positive aspect there, though, is that it still have rolled out for first set of companies, and it has a ripple effect. Because these companies, Scope 3 emissions, are smaller companies, Scope 2 emission. And Scope 2 is electricity. So it has ripple effects that can mitigate that. And that's why we are shifting our focus a bit to the clean industrial deal and see how companies can...
Because this is the element of that, the Corporate Sustainable Directive was postponed, as you mentioned, so stop the clock. So that's obviously a crucial element here for the demand side, and that we should probably mention that earlier, or I should have anyway, Daniel. So very remiss of me. But I think if we have a sort of final question, I think we probably will be discussing these kind of matching issues for a few more months, or maybe years. I hope not, but maybe if the policymakers do their job and put these in place, then maybe that'll put some sort of end to the discussion. But it has been ongoing now for many years. But the US is an interesting market. I mean, it's some of the biggest buyers of renewable certificates are companies in the US. Do you think this demand will decline following sort of Trump's policies? I mean, he's obviously he hates offshore wind, but I'm not sure if he's ambivalent to onshore. But he's certainly, drill baby drill is his motto. Is his but how does that affect renewables in the US, do you think? I don't know.
Jumping to the US market there, one of the things is the federal government don't have much to say on electricity policies in the US because it's the mandate of the state. And that's how the equivalent to the guarantees of origin market has evolve that, the REX market, the renewable energy certificates. And those are very much, the market there is driven by the renewable portfolio standards that they have, which essentially is a quota on the suppliers. They need to have a certain percentage in the supplied electricity, and also the voluntary demand. So I don't think it will have that much effect. It could have some on market sentiments, but it could also have the reversed effect that states just go in and say, oh, well, now we got to do more. But then we're probably talking blue states rather than red states.
Exactly, yeah. So, but it's as you rightly point out, it's a matter for the federal states rather than for the governments. Yeah. For the federal government.
Yeah. And then some companies in the US are operating in Europe as well. They're also operating in a different regulatory environment where the CSRD is actually in place for some bigger US companies at least. So then they need to comply with those rules.
But as you say, Daniel, it's there's a huge amount of uncertainty, and I think that's something that we can expect to continue for the coming weeks and months at least, maybe, and it'll keep us on our toes and very busy, I'm sure, Daniel.
Sure, there's a big need for our analytical expertise these days.
Absolutely, and for the news that covers these markets as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you again for joining us, Daniel.
Thank you, Richard. It was a pleasure.
And you listeners, thanks for listening to this episode of Plugged In. If you enjoyed this discussion, please like, rate, and follow to make sure you get the latest podcast episodes as soon as we release them every Friday. We'd also love to read your reviews of the podcast. It helps us to keep up to date with what you, our listeners, think of our podcast and what content you want to receive more of. Finally, you can head to montelnews.com for more news and analysis from our team of journalists across Europe and beyond. See you next time.